responding to sounds, and I was in complete denial that there was anything quote unquote wrong with Ryland. So yeah, I'll pass it to you so you can share.
Yeah, I mean, Ryland, we noticed Ryland wasn't hearing certain sounds, sought medical treatment or care for that, or at least a diagnosis, and Ryland was diagnosed as profoundly deaf at 13 months old. So we were kind of blindsided by that. We had waited to seek the medical care for that, or at least the diagnosis of that, for quite some time. I think we kind of just, well, one, being first-time parents, but two, just kind of not wanting to believe that there may be something more serious going on with our child. We regretfully kind of, just kind of chalked it up to, oh, it's just, he's just learning how to hear, it's or selective hearing and so on and so forth. Anyway, we got the profoundly deaf diagnosis and ended up researching cochlear implants, which we chose that as the path for Ryland. And Ryland did have the surgery and get access to sound starting at 19 months of age. So it was kind of a lesson learned for us, because we had been ignoring some of the signs and symptoms that we had seen early on. We lost some time in just catching Ryland up with hearing. It's a lot of work once someone is implanted to teach them how to hear, teach them how to speak. It isn't an instantaneous thing. It's a foreign, sensation for these children. So we vowed that we would never do that again, that kind of pushing off anything that we'd been seeing with our child. I wish that I had been better at holding to that. I think Hillary did a much better job with that, which we'll go into. But we thought that was probably going to be our biggest obstacle with Ryland. Little did we know we had a lot more in store for us. So kind of turn back to Hillary, and she's going to talk about some of what we started to see and what was going on.
Yeah, and just to kind of rewind a little bit, I think the reason why we talk about this is because I absolutely believe that this deaf journey, cochlear implant journey, was absolutely the platform that helped us understand Ryland's gender identity. We always say there was major lessons we learned. The first one was when I went to the doctor about this, he told me not to lose any sleep over it, and it probably was nothing. So that was the first thing. Trust your instincts, your motherly instincts. And then, the deaf community, if any of you are aware, are very much, for the most part, not all, but not so much, they're not fans of cochlear implants. And so we kind of learned early on that by getting Ryland cochlear implants, it was almost like he had instant, not enemies, but instant criticism from the deaf community. So we sort of had to just go with our gut and do what we thought was best. And we just felt like, if Ryland wants to be deaf one day, he just takes them off and he can enter deaf culture. And then again, not to push off anything that we saw in the future. So I won't get into all of the things that were happening with Ryland around 2, 3, 4, 5 years old, but I did write about all of them in our book. And I think we talk about them in some of the videos we do, but let me just say that he presented very much as our son from very, very early on. And I think the thing that was very hard for me was he was shameful. I think kids pick up on cues much more than we think they do. And he would always say, "Mommy, please don't tell anybody that I'm a boy." And it was almost like he was semi-ashamed of it because he knew that wasn't typical. But for me, the big aha moment came when he was about 5 years old. Jeff was working at the fire station, 24-hour shifts, and we were putting together Christmas cards, and Ryland came in and he saw the return address label, and I had depicted him as the sole character with long hair and a cowboy hat on. And Ryland looked at the cowboy hat and the picture of him, the little character, and he said, "Mommy, how could you do that to me?" Dead serious. And I said, "Do what to you, Ryland?" And he said, "Well, how could you make me look like a girl?" And I just sort of paused and I didn't really know what to say. And I just said, "Ryland, because you are a girl, honey." And mind you, we'd had many conversations leading up to this point about girls' genitalia and boys' genitalia. I thought I was doing my job as a parent. So Ryland got upset that night in bed. He said to me, this is the hardest part. In bed, he said to me, "Mommy, when the family dies, I'll cut my hair so I can be a boy," meaning that he didn't want to disappoint us by transitioning and being a boy while we were still alive. And for a 5-year-old to say that is pretty powerful and very upsetting as a mom, because again, I had seen so many other things that were happening. He wouldn't even eat off of a pink plate because he didn't want to be seen as a girl. So Ryland takes off his ears that night. He falls asleep crying. And the next morning he woke up and he continued on. He said, "Mommy, why did God make you this way?" And I was just, at that point, I was at my breaking point. I mean, I had already seen so much. This was a daily thing that was going on, just fighting with clothes and, people giving him feminine gifts that he just didn't like. And again, there's I could talk for hours about all of the signs and things that were happening. But again, that was my breaking point. And at the time, Jeff was a firefighter. He was in a very masculine world. And we had, as a family, gone to the fire station and had dinner with all the firefighters. And we really considered ourselves part of the San Diego City family. But I'll let you talk about this, because the firefighters did celebrate when Ryland was a tomboy. But once Ryland made that transition, it was a whole different story. So I'll let you talk about that.
Well, we'll go into a little bit of kind of to back up for a moment. I think there is a common misconception from those that are just getting to know us or get to know our story, that this was I would love to say that we were this super open-minded family, and we were open-minded, but that this was a very easy transition, a very easy thing for us to learn about and to accept and to figure out and to kind of support Ryland on. And it was definitely a journey for us. I didn't really understand it initially when Ryland was really showing the signs of being transgender, and I had kind of pushed back a little bit and just thinking, oh, Ryland's too young to figure this out. There's just no way. I mean, all of the criticism we get now, I mean, there was a portion of me that was probably saying some of those things and also kind of, pushing back a little bit. And Hillary was really moving forward on it, and it strained our relationship quite a bit. And it was hard for us to get, to get on the same page as it. But Hillary did eventually find a support group through the LGBT Center here in San Diego, which was for parents of transgender or gender nonconforming youth. And she encouraged me to go to it, which I had at the time reluctantly said, yes, I'll go, I'll listen. And that was kind of the transition for me. It was sitting at this table with a father that was across from us, who looked at me all of a sudden and said, "You are so lucky to be here right now," which I didn't really understand at first. And then he said, our child was expressing all of the same things that your child is expressing now at the same age, at the age of 4 and 5 years old. And they said, unfortunately, we didn't have the knowledge, we didn't have the resources, and nor the desire to really investigate that as early on as you are now. And because we ignored it and we pushed back, our child is cutting, our child has suicidal ideations, our child is binding so tight, they're collapsing along, so it's all of these things where I just stopped and paused and went, you know what? I really have to look at this more seriously. And so it was at that point that we really started to get onto the same page and investigate further. And that's where, come to that same conclusion and unified decision and understanding through, therapists and Ryland's physicians and talking to Ryland that he was indeed trans. And so,
but I think really quick, I like the whole world confused gender identity and sexuality from the very beginning. I just chalked it up to, Ryland would be a lesbian one day. I mean, I had already come to that conclusion really early on. I mean, not conclusion, but it's totally fine with that. Totally fine. And ironically, Jeff's gay brother and Jeff's gay aunt also thought that. I remember your aunt calling me from San Francisco and saying, yes, Ryland is like me, and she would send Ryland gifts. And even then, back then, what was that, 2012? This was before Caitlyn Jenner, anything in the media. It was, we all thought that Ryland would just be a lesbian one day. And again, that was completely fine, but it was just really weird talking about sexuality with a 5-year-old, a 4-year-old. And so it was really kind of an aha moment when we learned about gender identity. And gender identity is actually discovered between the ages of 2 and 5. However, we didn't realize that because our gender identity aligned with the gender we were assigned at birth. So you don't even realize that that's a thing. But but yeah, I think once we started to figure out, wrap our head around it, it made way more sense. And I think that that's the biggest misconception in our world to this day.
Yeah.
You know, but yeah.
Yeah.
So we met with a local therapist, Darlene Tando, and who was amazing. And I remember Jeff saying, can we just wait until Ryland enters the next grade for school, and we'll just let Ryland, not transition Ryland in the middle of the school year, because we knew that that was going to be a little rocky. And she said, no, you need to do this as soon as possible for their mental, for mental well-being. We transitioned Ryland socially in transitional kindergarten, which is kind of funny and ironic, but
yeah. So Ryland, at 5 years old, Ryland made the transition. It really started with conversation with Ryland on what do you want us to call you, Ryland? I mean, how are you, how do you see yourself? And Ryland said, I'm a boy. I want you to call me he, and say him. And so we made that pronoun change. And then the biggest thing, and I think probably the most transformative thing for him, was the haircut. Asking Ryland, do you want to cut your hair? And absolutely. So we went to the barber shop, and Ryland got this haircut that was very much a traditional, what people would typically consider to be the boy haircut, and he was beaming. That haircut, the change in those pronouns, you could tell that he finally felt like he was being seen, and he was being heard, and he was being understood. And I think that there was so much love transferred, in that moment, that he was a totally different kid. And that was so confirming for us, that we made the right decision. And I don't care what anyone else says out there or any of the other criticisms. We know, in seeing that in him, that he is true and authentic to himself, and feeling loved and supported in that. And so we've never looked back from that moment. We've always been very open-minded, and we've always said, that in that, if Ryland were to one day come to us and say, this doesn't feel right anymore, I don't know that this was the right path, then that's fine. We'll support however Ryland feels, and whoever Ryland is.
I think, sorry, I don't want to interrupt you. I just don't want to forget that by allowing him to transition young, I felt like we took that burden off of him and we wore it. Right. Because I think the transition is it's hard. It's tough for people. And I think by allowing him to do it so young, we were the ones that sort of shielded him from anyone who wasn't loving towards him. I mean, we cut out our family, some of our family who was not on board, that family from Oklahoma. We stopped speaking to them. We said, look, if you can't support Ryland for who he is, then our relationship stops right here. And I think a lot of trans people who make a transition on their own, it's just a lot when you have people that don't get it. And luckily he had this little bubble of support, and he wasn't around people who didn't love him because they were out. And I think that that's really important. I think that that's also helped him become the confident person he is today, because he hasn't had to really feel any rejection or meanness. Like we don't, he did, I don't know. Yeah. Sorry, I totally interrupted you, but I just think that that's an important piece of the puzzle. I think the sooner that you can recognize and support, children who feel this way, I think the better, because anyone who has a troubled childhood or has to deal with any kind of abuse or anything like that, I think it affects you as an adult. For
sure.
So
well, and just in the interest of time, we'll just touch really quick on just where we're at now. So that was, Ryland transitioned at the age of 5. He's now 13. So we've been living this journey for the last 8 years, which is amazing. And boy, it has been a journey, and it has put us in contact with some of the most amazing people and opportunities to do things like this. And so we're so grateful for that. But Ryland is 13. So Ryland has started to, that's the confirmation of the transition through more medical treatments at this point as a 13-year-old. But he's going into 8th grade, typical teenage personality.
Vice president at his school, playing sports, lots of friends.
Yeah, he plays, he plays ice hockey, he plays water polo, and is very competitive at both. And that's, with everything we've got going on right now with trans youth and sports, we're really paying attention to that, because sports have been such a big part of his life and a big part of just who he is, and creating that confidence in him, and just to have something like that stripped away. I don't know, we're definitely in the middle of that fight right now for sure. So
we did mention that he might want to come in for some of the questions later, but so they are both here, but
yeah,
we'll let Christine, I would love to hear from Christine.
yeah, that's kind of our journey and our story. So
Thank you so very much. We will move over to hear from Christine Garcia.
Hi there, my name is Christine Garcia. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. So I wanted to come today and talk to you guys about my experience in coming out as a transgender woman on the San Diego Police Department. So I came out in July of 2015 to my agency as transgender. This was something that much like Ryland that you guys were talking about, I from an early age knew that something was different and knew that I was not living my truth. But there wasn't as much resources for me. I'm 37 years old. The internet really wasn't a thing until I was about 14, 15 years old. And I felt like I was truly ingrained in living my life as male. It was something that I put off for a very long time. Ever since I can remember, I was dressing up as a girl in my room, trying to lock my doors, hide it from my parents. I grew up very conservative and Catholic as well. And my dad was a San Diego police sergeant at the time. I, much like him, followed in his footsteps. I first became an EMT, and then I worked on a fire engine, and then I transferred over to the police department later. But as a police officer, I did not think that you could be transgender and be an officer. I did much research online. I tried to put it off for as long as I could. I got married, had 2 kids. I am still married and have those 2 kids still. And it's just been a wonderful life since then. But in about July of 2015, I made the decision to come out as transgender. I did a lot of research online to try to find other police officers who were transgender as well. And I came across a group called T-Cops International. It's a transgender community of police and sheriffs. And I reached out to them, asked them about some of their experiences. There was about 50 or so police officers around the world who had transitioned on their departments. Most of them, not good stories. It was a very masculine profession, much like the fire department, as we were mentioning earlier. And historically, there have been laws that were anti-LGBT in nature in the 60s and 70s, and the police department was tasked in going out and enforcing of those laws, which created a very homophobic culture within law enforcement. And that culture was even stuck around to present day. But some of the stories that I heard is some transgender individuals came out on their departments, went out the next day, got into fights with suspects, called for cover, and no cover would show up. And these were the things that I was really worried about here in San Diego. Essentially, I was going from masculine to feminine in a masculine profession, and that scared the living hell out of me. But I decided to do it anyways, because it's my personality and my behavior traits to do so. And I came out to the chief of police. There was nobody in Southern California who had done that since then, except for a couple of people within the LA County Sheriffs. I did seek out guidance from the LA County Sheriffs of how their officers have come out, how they're doing. But the officers in LA County Sheriffs were all trans men, transitioning from female to male in a masculine profession. But my chief wanted to make my coming out process what I wanted it to be. I had heard officers say some pretty homophobic and transphobic things prior to coming out. I worked 8 years as male, kind of, I like to say I was kind of disguised as this straight male in the department, and just overhearing some of the things the officer said. I did not think that I could come out as transgender. Right around the time Caitlyn Jenner had been coming out, and the memes and jokes that were circulating around the department were just all the time, just going on all the time. But I came out to my chief and I wrote a long email to all the officers on the department, explaining that I was transgender, explaining that I wanted to transition on the police department. I had a very good reputation then as an officer. I'd gotten officer of the ship twice, a couple commanding officer citations. And a lot of the response I got back was, we don't care as long as you're a good cop and that's all that matters. I would say about 50% of the department out of 1,800 officers, 50% were in that mindset. And I would say about the other 49% of the officers were just kind of unsure. And of course I had that 1% that was, and I'm not going to say derogatory, but very ignorant with their belief in what transgender was. I knew a lot of what I had to do was overcome perception of what transgender is on the department. A lot of people thought, you know, oh, you're just going to be guy in a wig and everybody's going to know. And it's going to be embarrassing to the suspects when you show up on scene. And as I started to transition, I got to show them that that is not what being transgender actually is. And I was able to change those perceptions. And I teach at California Association of Chiefs of Police right now. And something I tell the newer chiefs that are becoming chiefs for their agency is we don't really see a turning point in culture in law enforcement until other officers start coming out around you on your agency, or that you start hiring transgender individuals. And our chief in the 1980s was Bob Bergreen, and he knew this to be true. Ever since the first day of becoming chief, wanted to recruit LGBT individuals on the department, knew that would be the actual deciding change and to change that culture within law enforcement. Then we had our first officer come out in the 1990s. That person's experience was not the same as mine. As a matter of fact, several officers started to come out after that one person did. And we had a total of about 10 officers on the department come out as transgender. And the first LGBT pride parade that they walked in 1991 was not very well accepted by the other officers. As a matter of fact, most of the officers turned their backs on those cops as they walked by. But after a while, they started to gain acceptance, but we still hadn't gained acceptance for the transgender side. And when I came out, it's that true change of hearts and minds, showing the officers that because this is a brotherhood, a sisterhood, a sibling type of environment here, that's when we actually see the change within law enforcement. I, at the time, knew that there was a place for me as a liaison on this department. I knew that there were things that needed to be done to make sure that we are respecting our transgender community, because now I have two families. I have the LGBT community as one of my families, and I have the law enforcement community as the other side of my family. And I want to see both of my siblings get along. And so therefore I took, in 2016, I took a position as the transgender community liaison for the San Diego Police Department, working in conjunction with an officer here, or a lieutenant here named Daniel Meyer, where I worked with this individual, this other person, in regards to the community and trying to strengthen relationships between the police department and the community from 2016 to about 2020, where Lieutenant Meyer had stepped down as a liaison and I took over as LGBTQ community liaison. I do want to talk about a little bit of what we do here at the San Diego Police Department to make sure that we respect our community. So recently we released a procedure that I wrote in regards to respecting the transgender community. That procedure is a clear guideline to officers of how they're to respect our community. It includes definitions. It includes guidance and training for AB 2504, which was a law that was passed in regards to training law enforcement officers across the state in LGBTQ diversity and rights for LGBT individuals. It also establishes guidelines for all of SDPD employees regarding the respect and interaction with the transgender community. So how they're to be referred to. And also the gender non-binary community is included in this procedure. It includes report writing, how the officers are to write their reports for somebody whose ID does not match their gender identity and their preferred name and pronouns. It also establishes guidelines for radio calls. If the officer shall respond to a radio call where there is a, like, easiest way to put it is what we all know is the bathroom incident, where if somebody calls on a transgender or gender non-binary individual and they believe that they're in the wrong facility, it spells out to the officers that Civil Code Section 51B allows any persons and all persons within the jurisdiction of California to have free right to those facilities, regardless of or including their race, religion, orientation, sexual orientation, and gender identity, for instance. It also goes over pat downs and searches of transgender and non-binary individuals, the booking and transporting of non-binary individuals, which San Diego County Jail here in San Diego does house transgender individuals according to gender identity. So back in the day, we used to have to ask the genitalia question and ask them what their genitalia was to house them in the facility that matches their genitalia. Now, no longer is that a standard practice for the San Diego Police Department, nor is it a standard practice for the San Diego County Sheriff's Department. It also goes over resources for officers. So if they encounter somebody who's LGBT, they have a list of resources to give to them, and a clear understanding for our internal affairs unit in regarding misconduct of this policy and discipline of officers for violating the policy. Another couple of things we do is I've developed a program that's modeled after Seattle's Safe Place program. And it's a sticker that goes on businesses that also has a QR code on it, that anybody walking by and sees the Safe Place sticker, they can scan that QR code. It takes them to the San Diego Police Department website, and it goes over everything the San Diego Police Department has for the community, which is that policy and procedure is on there. It also has our Chiefs Advisory Board, which is a list of stakeholders within the LGBT community that come up to the chief's office bi-yearly, and we go over the issues that the LGBT community is facing with our law enforcement and how we can work past those issues through implementation of training, policy and procedure, and then enforcement of these policy and procedures. Definition of a hate crime is on there as well. And then there's also a button to click on, which allows users to submit a suspicious activity report directly to the FBI. So if something doesn't meet the threshold of a crime, but somebody is, let's say, walking around Hillcrest with 2 knives, which was an incident that did occur, and they were doing it just to intimidate our community, individuals were able to go on there and submit their videos and pictures of this person to the FBI, and the FBI and the San Diego Police Department were able to work in collaboration with each other in order to seek out these individuals, identify them, and find out what their motives are, and then possibly even document past behavior. Maybe even if it's not a crime, if a crime is eventually occurred or done on the LGBT community, it allows us to use that prior behavior of this individual to bring into court. And then we also have a manual that I wrote on transitioning employees and fostering and creating a safe workplace for LGBTQ employees, including transgender employees. We want to make sure that we're being respectful to all of our officers. It's not that we're trying to what's the word I'm looking for? Give transgender employees more rights than other individuals on the department. We understand that there's a different aspect to transitioning on the department. I kind of make fun of our gay officers when I tell them, some of our LGBT officers are not open about their sexual orientation, but transgender employees have to be open about who they are because they undergo that change within the department. And so there's a different aspect to having to come out as transgender, having to transition on the department, talking about locker room usage and training for that particular division on somebody who's coming out as transgender, what the city policies are. And so because of that different aspect, we try to make sure that we have a manual that spells out to the department and to its admin and its officers what is expected of them, and also a clear-cut guideline for the employee coming out as transgender. What is the next step? How can I get my name legally changed on the law enforcement systems? So for instance, even though I was the first and we didn't have this manual to begin with before, the San Diego Police Department was able to change my name in all the law enforcement systems, except for how I received my paychecks, in my preferred name, regardless of when I had gotten my legal name changed. I hadn't gotten my legal name changed for a full year after coming out as transgender, but the department was able to recognize me and in my preferred name, to, how I receive my subpoenas, to my email system. So when I send people emails, they could see that the officer who appeared at the scene, it appeared female. They were getting emails that said Christine Garcia and the correct name. So yeah, that's about everything that we do. We have 4 liaisons for the San Diego Police Department and for the LGBT community. We do have a total of 9 different community liaisons that for other different minority communities, and each community liaison is a direct reflection of that community that they serve. So everybody who serves as the LGBT liaison is within a family member of the LGBT community. Our African-American community liaisons, or Muslim community liaisons, Jewish community liaisons, every single community that needs a liaison to have access to has one, and they all have their own chief's advisory board that meets with our chief to make sure that we are respecting our community. I can say that the culture within law enforcement in 2021 is not the same that it was in 2007 when I got hired. It is much more diverse and much more accepting of all of our communities and treating all of our communities with respect. And with it, I'll pass it on to questions.
Thank you very much, Christine. Let's open this up now to questions for Hillary and Jeff and Christine.
Just from a medical surgical perspective, surgeons and endocrinologists, for example, they used to have a great program in Oklahoma of when they made the transition, and once they get the right diagnosis of transgender, then the surgery goes, that's not the obstacle. It really goes very well. The reason they ended up having to shut those programs down a while ago was because they could, once people were transitioned, they didn't want to provide any more follow-up feedback. They wanted to live their life in their new setting, and they couldn't get the data to support it. And my understanding right now is one of the leading theories is that when the brain develops in utero, there may be sex hormones available to develop the gonads early in development, but later in development, the receptors in the brain may not be as sensitive to those hormones. So there's a differential exposure to hormonal influences. And I'm just wondering, with more data, how does that theory sit with you? And do you think that propagating more of the data would help change the culture? Or, are people going to have a backlash from that?
We can answer. I mean, I can say that I think the more research that is done to show that this isn't a choice, just like being part of the LGBT community, everyone, I think the more that we can prove that this isn't a choice, that this is just another human natural differentiate, what's the word? Differentiate. And you know what I mean? Like some have blue eyes, some have brown eyes. This is just another human variant that unfortunately is treated much differently. And yeah, I think that the more research that can be done that shows that this is something that is, as a development in utero or whatever, genetic, whatever, I think the more power, not power, but I think the more validity it gives all of us.
Yeah, I mean, but I think that it's a two-sided coin though, right? It's the other side of that I think becomes more worrisome is um, this idea of this identification of where being trans comes from, and identifying essentially the source then opens up the door towards an effort then to try and eradicate that, right? To identify if it's a genetic component, to then go in and alter the genetics and create a scenario where no more babies are born that are trans or identify as trans. I think thereby creating, them going back into this very marginalized group, smaller population. I don't know. So I think that there's, certainly identifying where it comes from could be helpful and proving to people, look, this, yeah, like Hillary said, this is not something that is choice driven. This is human. This is what it means to be human. But and it's hard to answer that and say that, because it's kind of almost what we did with Ryland in his hearing. Ryland was born deaf. I mean, there's a lot of people in the deaf culture who would state that, there's an identity in being deaf. There's a culture in being deaf. There is a culture that people who are deaf are very proud of. And we've
fixed it.
Essentially gone in and fixed that, given him access to sound and removed him from that deaf culture, or not exposed him to that. And it's kind of now this deaf population is getting smaller and smaller and smaller as more people are in the hearing world who are born deaf. So I think it's a slippery slope for sure. And I don't know, Christine, I don't know. I would love to hear your response on that for sure.
So I think there's two parts to that question I'd like to answer. But I do agree that I myself have tried to sit here and identify the source of why I am the way that I am. I remember going to therapy. The first thing I said to the therapist was, do you make a pill that makes me normal? Right? Because I didn't want to be this way. I was a father and a husband and a cop, and I just wanted to be quote unquote normal, or that heteronormalcy that society has. And I didn't want this. I try to explain it to people like this, because a lot of people get confused with it's a choice, it's not a choice. And I explain it to people like this. No matter what I did in my life, I couldn't get rid of this feeling. Being transgender was not a choice. Transitioning to me was a choice. Of course, I could have chose not to transition, and I would have been miserable and unhappy my entire life. And the reason why I started seeking out therapy is because depression started to set in my life, because I wasn't living as my authentic self. And this is the reason why from the DSM-4 to the DSM-5, they changed being transgender from a mental illness to removing the pathology that made it a mental illness. And because they started to see that as people were coming to them with mental illness issues, as soon as that person would transition, those mental illnesses would go away. Depression would go away. They would no longer needed the medication. But then another aspect of that kicked in, right? So the medical community, and this is kind of the second part of the question, the medical community started to say, well, we'll start to give transgender individuals access to cross hormone treatment or hormone replacement therapy, and also access to sexual reassignment surgery. And a lot of the medical community thought as soon as you got that sexual reassignment surgery, that all of your depression should go away, because that was what we wanted, right? But what they started to realize is not every transgender individual wants the surgery, A, and B, after certain individuals were transitioning, they still had the body dysmorphia, which is the extreme dislikes towards certain characteristics of your body. Maybe the hormones didn't develop the size or didn't develop breasts at all for the individual, and breast augmentation was not covered. Facial feminization surgery was not covered at the time. When I first came out, I had to pay to have all of my facial hair removed because they considered that cosmetic. And what they started to realize is they were funding the sexual reassignment surgery, but they weren't funding anything else for us to transition. And so we weren't able to transition and blend into society the way that we wanted to. Certain people within the community are not being recognized as their gender identity, because every day they didn't get the chance to transition early in life. So certain characteristics that are primarily masculine or feminine in their lives started to set in. And so they've had to pay for the surgeries. I use Caitlyn Jenner as an example again. Caitlyn Jenner had to spend $40,000 on facial reconstructive surgery to get rid of the masculine characteristics in her face to allow her to feel more respected as female or identified as female within society. And so as the medical community has progressed over these last couple of years, they've started funding breast augmentation. They started funding facial feminization surgery because they know that, and we see it with some data, that suicide rates among the transgender community is really high, disproportionately high. And even including after they had sexual reassignment surgery, our suicide rates were still high because we weren't being accepted within culture within America. So, I guess that kind of answers your question. Me specifically, I didn't have any surgeries. I didn't have sexual reassignment surgery. I am the type of transgender individual where I don't have that dysphoria or dislike towards my genitalia. I don't feel like that's the end all be all towards my gender identity. When I go out and I'm working with the majority of society every single day, because I do collision investigation, and so I'm talking to people on a daily basis, they don't recognize me as male. They recognize me as female. And so for me, once I started getting recognized as female among society, my dysphoria was more managed in my life than before. And so a lot of the depression and anxiety and everything that was occurring kind of started to subside. But my story is rare, even to today, within law enforcement and acceptance of transgender individuals within most jobs nowadays. And so acceptance at home, acceptance, my wife accepted me, my kids accept me, my family accepts me. So family acceptance, job acceptance, society acceptance, as that starts to progress, we start to see those suicide rates drop within America. So it's kind of coming from all sides of how that is accepted, or how we are being accepted within society from the medical standpoint, in gaining that in order to be recognized as our gender identity.
Thank you.
Other questions? Okay, I'm going to post a question. I have two questions, actually. One, how would you recommend that teachers, family, friends be aware of children who might not identify with their assigned sex at birth and might be struggling to vocalize that?
Yeah, I think from a lot of the people that I've talked to on this journey, I think, the more that kids can see others like them, I think that that's helpful. I've talked to a lot of transgender adults that have said to me they had never seen or heard of anyone that was transgender when they were younger, and that made it harder for them. And so I think just to normalize the experience, also not to categorize children by girls and boys. There's tons of educational pieces out there on HRC's website and all sorts of different websites that I can provide links to, but separating children by like favorite colors, or I don't know, just different ways of trying to separate children and just to not isolate them. I think that the more that we can even give children gender neutral names, I think the better off we'll be, because you just don't know. You don't know until a child is able to talk what their gender is. And I think, I don't know, yeah, just the more that we can be accepting and open-minded about their feelings and listening to them, I think the better off we'll be.
If I can just plug in, remember the movie Finding Nemo?
Yeah.
And those fish males become females and females become male. That's very, very common. And I think if they would, educate kids about how fish can change, that might be one model for helping kids appreciate that, this is a natural process in nature.
Yeah, and even for cisgender children who, do identify with their assigned gender, I think it's very important to expose them to gender identity early on too. There are a ton of books out there for children that are important for all children, just because then it makes them more loving and accepting to the classmate that transitions, or the aunt or the uncle in their life that transitions, or whatever. And so I think the more that we can just
normalize the
normalize,
conversation.
and that goes with, I mean, all different things, right? Not just gender, but I think just educating children early on. And it's so funny because I feel like so many people out there are like, oh, they're too young, don't talk to them about that. No, the earlier you can talk to kids about all different types of people and situations, I think the better off we'll be.
Yeah, I mean, we always laugh and say it's not the kids that are the issues, it's the adults, right? And so, I mean, when Ryland transitioned at 5 years old, the pushback we got, the issues that we had were with the parents who didn't want to have the conversations, who didn't have a desire to normalize this, who didn't have a desire to do any work, in order to help support children like Ryland. The kids in the class, Ryland showed up one day being referred to as, she and female, and then the teacher made the announcement of, this is how we're going to refer to Ryland, and Ryland identifies as a boy. And the kids' response were great. Ryland, you want to go play? I mean, they don't care. They will take our guidance. They are going to look to us for, acceptance, and to show them what is okay and what isn't okay, and to have those conversations. And the more that we do that, the more we're going to raise generations that are going to continue to be supportive and hopefully no longer see this to be, this hot topic of conversation.
Thank you.
Good, yeah.
Other questions?
Ryland.
I think Hillary was gonna grab Ryland so he could pop in real quick and at least
Sure.
give a hello.
Susan and Christine and
Hi, Ryland. Thank you for joining us.
Christine. So yeah, we're just enjoying our very not common day of not having something to do early in the morning. So we let our kids sort of enjoy their morning today. I feel like we're, like most parents, running from water polo to hockey to swimming to dance. So it's been kind of a nice a nice break in the schedule today.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about just like what's going on in life?
We can leave it at questions.
Yeah.
If anyone's got questions, we know.
What's your best favorite sport?
Oh man, I don't know. I like water polo right now. It's pretty fun.
Which it was a little bit of a challenge trying to get some cochlear implants to fit on his head so he can hear in the water, but we figured it out. So we're resourceful.
Yeah.
What about you, Bren? What's your favorite thing right now?
I don't know.
Talk louder.
I like soccer and dance and swim.
But it's funny, we laugh. We feel like we're a very typical family. I mean, our kids have their chores. They have to eat their vegetables, say please and thank you. We kind of laugh because I feel like we're just like any other family, huh?
So yeah, you fight with your sister and vice versa. That one.
Never.
It definitely wasn't an argument this morning.
Yeah.
Christine, how old are your kids now?
So my oldest is 10 years old, and my youngest is 7 years old. My youngest has autism, so it's pretty challenging at times. But, again, just like, we mentioned earlier, there's multiple different families out there. And so my kids call me mommy, and they have, we didn't force that on them. In fact, for the first year of my transition, my kids called me dad. Still, it wasn't until my daughter went into kindergarten that after her first week of school, I picked her up from school and she said, "Can I call you mom?" And I said, "Why do you want to do that?" And she said, "I don't know. The other dads don't look like you around there, and I'd rather just call you what kind of what the other kids what their parents look like. And I said, yeah, that's fine. So she tells the kids that she has two moms. At times she gets bullied for it. But we try to teach her that there's people out there who don't understand, and that's taught to them by their parents. It's like we said, it's the parents. And like you said earlier, if parents would just listen to their kids sometimes, when they are trying to come out as transgender. I've had several officers on this department whose kids have come out as transgender, and I've had some families make the decision that they're going to wait until their kid is 18 to make that decision. And I've explained to them what that does to their child. If their child starts to go through that puberty phase, and you're causing your child more trauma as they get older to have to get all these surgeries, then if you just let them be a kid and let them identify how they feel, it's something that doesn't go away.
Well, if it helps, give them our phone number.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So what do you want to be when you grow up?
I have no idea. Still like trying to figure that out.
What did you, the last thing you said to me was a lawyer. Maybe. It's hard to know when you're young. I don't know.
Yeah.
He's still figuring that one out.
What about you, Bren?
I don't know. A lot of people say I should be a doctor, but I don't know.
Well, that's a good
It's
choice.
fun.
Whatever they're passionate about.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much. The Whittington family, Christine Garcia, thank you very much for spending your morning with us. We really appreciate it. Next week at the forum will be the San Diego Women's Chorus. So we will see you then. Have a great.
Stacy, before you sign off,
Yes.
this is Susan.
Hi, Sue.
I just wanted to thank the Whittingtons so much. And also I want to let you all know, I believe Officer Garcia is on duty today and will be making our community safe as we march up to the flag a little bit later. So thank you all so very much. I personally just really appreciate it. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, as soon as this is over, I head straight down to 6th and Upis to make sure that our march will be safe.
Awesome. Thank you again, everyone. Have a wonderful Sunday and be safe out there.
Thank
Christine.
you.
Right.
Thank you.
See you later.
Bye-bye.